Tonight, we are introduced to the world of the 25th century as envisioned by author Alfred Bester. In a different story than this one, he wrote of the relentless force of evolution that insisted on endowing man with increased powers without removing his vestigial vices. This is an apt description of the world in which our story begins, a world where humans have colonized the solar system and psychic phenomena are a recognized part of life, yet where the old impulses for power, greed, and prejudice and hostility between people and factions have not been overcome, but continue to drive decisions and historical events. We are also introduced to our character of interest, marooned, caught in the direst of circumstances, desperate to survive and almost without any hope of escape from his plight. In tonight's performance, we have Dave as Gully Foyle, Sandy as Sarah Thompson, Beverly as a reporter, Bill as a recruiting officer, Ray as Sir John Kelvin and as Gully Foyle's inner experience, and Dan will be the narrator. And now, The Stars, My Destination by Alfred Bester, Episode 1. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? Prologue. This was a golden age, a time of high adventure, rich living, and hard dying. But nobody thought so. This was a future of fortune and theft, pillage and rapine, culture and vice. But nobody admitted it. This was an age of extremes, a fascinating century of freaks. But nobody loved it. All the habitable worlds of the solar system were occupied. 3 planets and 8 satellites and 11 million people swarmed in one of the most exciting ages ever known. Yet minds still yearned for other times. As always, the solar system seethed with activity, fighting, feeding, and breeding, learning the new technologies that spewed forth almost before the old had been mastered, girding itself for the first exploration of the far stars in deep space. But
where are the new frontiers?
The romantics cried, unaware that the frontier of the mind had opened in a laboratory on Callisto at the turn of the 24th century. A researcher named Jaunt set fire to his bench and himself, accidentally, and let out a yell for help with particular reference to a fire extinguisher. None were so surprised as Jaunt and his colleagues when he found himself standing alongside said extinguisher, 70 feet removed from his lab bench. They put Jaunt out and went into the whys and wherefores of his instantaneous 70-foot journey. Teleportation, the transportation of oneself through space by an effort of the mind alone, had long been a theoretic concept, and there were a few hundred badly documented proofs that it had happened in the past. This was the first time that it had ever taken place before professional observers. They investigated the Jaunt effect savagely. This was something too earth-shaking to handle with kid gloves, and Jaunt was anxious to make his name immortal. He made his will and said farewell to his friends. Jaunt knew he was going to die because his fellow researchers were determined to kill him if necessary. There was no doubt about that. 12 psychologists, parapsychologists, and neurometrists of varying specialization were called in as observers. The experimenters sealed Jaunt into an unbreakable crystal tank. They opened a water valve, feeding water into the tank, and let Jaunt watch them smash the valve handle. It was impossible to open the tank. It was impossible to stop the flow of water. The theory was that if it had required the threat of death to goad Jaunt into teleporting himself in the first place, They damned well threatened him with death again. The tank filled quickly. The observers collected data with the tense precision of an eclipse camera crew. Jaunt began to drown. Then he was outside the tank, dripping and coughing explosively. He teleported again. The experts examined and questioned him. They studied graphs and x-rays, neural patterns, and body chemistry. They began to get an inkling of how Jaunt had teleported. On the technical grapevine, this had to be kept secret. They sent out a call for suicide volunteers. They were still in the primitive stage of teleportation. Death was the only spur they knew. They briefed the volunteers thoroughly. Jaunt lectured on what he had done and how he thought he had done it. Then they proceeded to murder the volunteers. They drowned them, hanged them, burned them. They invented new forms of slow and controlled death. There was never any doubt in any of the subjects that death was the object. 80% of the volunteers died, and the agonies and remorse of their murderers would make a fascinating and horrible study. But that has no place in this history except to highlight the monstrosity of the times. 80% of the volunteers died, but 20% jaunted. The name became a word almost immediately. The Romantics pleaded,
Bring back the romantic age, when men could risk their lives in high adventure.
the body of knowledge grew rapidly. By the first decade of the 24th century, the principles of jaunting were established, and the first school was opened by Charles Fort Jaunt himself, then 57, immortalized and ashamed to admit that he had never dared jaunt again. But the primitive days were past. It was no longer necessary to threaten a man with death to make him teleport. They had learned how to teach man to recognize, discipline, and exploit yet another resource of his limitless mind. How exactly did man teleport? One of the most unsatisfactory explanations was provided by Sarah Thompson, publicity representative of the Jaunt schools, in a press interview.
Jaunting is like seeing. It is a natural aptitude of almost every human organism, but it can only be developed by training and experience.
You mean we couldn't see without practice?
Obviously, you're either unmarried or have no children, preferably both.
I don't understand.
Anyone who's observed an infant learning to use its eyes would.
But what is teleportation?
The transportation of oneself from one locality to another by an effort of the mind alone.
You mean we can think ourselves from, say, New York to Chicago?
Precisely, provided one thing is clearly understood. In jaunting from New York to Chicago, it is necessary for the person teleporting himself to know exactly where he is when he starts and where he's going.
Well, how's that?
If you were in a dark room and unaware of where you were, it would be impossible to jaunt anywhere with safety. And if you knew where you were but intended to jaunt to a place you had never seen, you would never arrive alive. One cannot jaunt from an unknown departure point to an unknown destination. Both must be known, memorized, and visualized.
But if we know where we are and where we are going,
We can be pretty sure we'll jaunt and arrive.
would we arrive naked?
If you started naked,
I mean, would our clothes teleport with us?
When people teleport, they also teleport the clothes they wear and whatever they are strong enough to carry. I hate to disappoint the gentlemen, but even ladies' clothes would arrive with them.
Oh, but how do we do it?
How do we think?
With our minds.
And how does the mind think? What is the thinking process? Exactly how do we remember, imagine, deduce, create? Exactly how do the brain cells operate?
I don't know. Nobody knows.
And nobody knows exactly how we teleport either, but we know we can do it, just as we know that we can think. Have you ever heard of Descartes? He said, "Cogito ergo sum," I think, therefore I am. We say, "Cogito ergo jauntio," I think, therefore I jaunt.
If it is thought that Thompson's explanation is exasperating, inspect this report of Sir John Kelvin to the Royal Society on the Mechanism of Jaunting.
We have established that the teleportative ability is associated with Nissl bodies, or tigroid substance in nerve cells. The tigroid substance is easiest demonstrated by Nissl's method using 3.7 grams of methylene blue and 1.6 grams of Venetian soap dissolved in 1,000 cc's of water. Where the tigroid substance does not appear, jaunting is impossible. Teleportation is a tigroid function. Any man was capable of jaunting, provided he developed two faculties, visualization and concentration. He had to visualize completely and precisely the spot to which he desired to teleport himself, and he had to concentrate the latent energy of his mind into a single thrust to get him there. Above all, he had to have faith, the faith that Charles Fort Jaunt never recovered. He had to believe he would jaunt. The slightest doubt would block the mind thrust necessary for teleportation. The limitations with which every man is born necessarily limited the ability to jaunt. Some could visualize magnificently and set the coordinates of their destination with precision, but lacked the power to get there. Others had the power, but could not, so to speak, see where they were jaunting. And space set a final limitation, for no man had ever jaunted further than 1,000 miles. He could work his way in jaunting jumps over land and water from Rome to Mexico, but no jump could exceed 1,000 miles.
By the 2420s, this form of employment application blank had become a commonplace. This space reserved for retina pattern identification. Name, capital letters, last, middle, first. Residence, legal. Continent, country, county. Jaunt class, official rating, check 1 only. M, 1,000 miles. D, 500 miles. C, 100 miles. L, 50 miles. X, 10 miles. V, 5 miles. The old Bureau of Motor Vehicles took over the new job and regularly tested and classed jaunt applicants, and the old American Automobile Association changed its initials to AJA. Despite all efforts, no man had ever jaunted across the voids of space, although many experts and fools had tried. Helmut Grant, for one, who spent a month memorizing the coordinates of a jaunt stage on the moon and visualized every mile of the 240,000-mile trajectory from Times Square to Kepler City. Grant jaunted and disappeared. They never found him. They never found N.C.O. Dandridge, a Los Angeles revivalist looking for heaven. Jakob Maria Freundlich, a paraphysicist who should have known better than to jaunt into deep space searching for metadimensions. Shipwreck Kogan, a professional seeker after notoriety, and hundreds of others, lunatic fringers, neurotics, escapists, and suicides. Space was closed to teleportation. Jaunting was restricted to the surfaces of the planets of the solar system. But within 3 generations, the entire solar system was on the jaunt. The transition was more spectacular than the changeover from horse and buggy to gasoline age 4 centuries before. On 3 planets and 8 satellites, social, legal, and economic structures crashed, while the new customs and laws demanded by universal jaunting mushroomed in their place. There were land riots as the jaunting poor deserted slums to squat in plains and forests, raiding the livestock and wildlife. There was a revolution in home and office building. Labyrinths and masking devices had to be introduced to prevent unlawful entry by jaunting. There were crashes and panics and strikes and famines as pre-jaunt industries failed. Plagues and pandemics raged as jaunting vagrants carried disease and vermin into defenseless countries. Malaria, elephantiasis, and the breakbone fever came north to Greenland. Rabies returned to England after an absence of 300 years. The Japanese beetle, the citrus scale, the chestnut blight, and the elm borer spread to every corner of the world. And from one forgotten pest hole in Borneo, leprosy, long imagined extinct, reappeared. Crime waves swept the planets and satellites as their underworlds took to jaunting with the night around the clock, and there were brutalities as the police fought them without quarter. There came a hideous return to the worst prudery of Victorianism as society fought the sexual and moral dangers of jaunting with protocol and taboo. A cruel and vicious war broke out between the inner planets, Venus, Terra, and Mars, and the outer satellites, a war brought on by the economic and political pressures of teleportation. Until the jaunt age dawned, the 3 inner planets and the moon had lived in delicate economic balance with the 7 inhabited outer satellites, Io, Europa, Ganymede and Callisto of Jupiter, Rhea and Titan of Saturn, and Lassell of Neptune. The united outer satellites supplied raw materials for the inner planets' manufactories and a market for their finished goods. Within a decade, this balance was destroyed by jaunting. The outer satellites, raw young worlds in the making, had bought 70% of the inner planet's transportation production. Jaunting ended that. They had bought 90% of the inner planet's communications production. Jaunting ended that too. In consequence, inner planet's purchase of outer satellite raw materials fell off. With trade exchange destroyed, it was inevitable that the economic war would degenerate into a shooting war. Inner planet's cartels refused to ship manufacturing equipment to the outer satellites, attempting to protect themselves against competition. The outer satellites confiscated the plants already in operation on their worlds, broke patent agreements, ignored royalty obligations, and the war was on. It was an age of freaks, monsters, and grotesques. All the world was misshapen in marvelous and malevolent ways. The classicists and romantics who hated it were unaware of the potential greatness of the 25th century. They were blind to a cold fact of evolution, that progress stems from the clashing merger of antagonistic extremes, out of the marriage of pinnacle freaks. Classicists and romantics alike were unaware that the solar system was trembling on the verge of a human explosion that would transform man and make him the master of the universe. Against this seething background of the 25th century, we now begin the vengeful history of Gully Foyle. He was 170 days dying and not yet dead. He fought for survival with the passion of a beast in a trap. He was delirious and rotting, but occasionally his primitive mind emerged from the burning nightmare of survival into something resembling sanity. Then he lifted his mute face to eternity and muttered,
"What's the matter, me? Help, you goddamn gods! Help is all."
Blasphemy came easily to him. It was half his speech, all his life. He had been raised in the gutter school of the 25th century and spoke nothing but the gutter tongue. Of all brutes in the world, he was among the least valuable alive and most likely to survive. So he struggled and prayed in blasphemy, but occasionally his raveling mind leapt backward 30 years to his childhood and remembered a nursery jingle.
Gully Foyle is my name, and Terra is my nation. Deep space is my dwelling place, and that's my destination.
He was Gulliver Foyle, mechanic's mate, third class, 30 years old, big boned and rough, and 170 days adrift in space. He was Gully Foyle, the oiler, wiper, bunkerman, too easy for trouble, too slow for fun, too empty for friendship, too lazy for love. The lethargic outlines of his character showed in the official Merchant Marine records.
Foyle, Gulliver, AS-128/127-006. Education, none. Skills, none. Merits, none. Recommendations, none. Personnel comments. A man of physical strength and intellectual potential, stunted by lack of ambition. Energius et minimero, the stereotype common man. Some unexpected shock might possibly awaken him, but psych cannot find the key. Not recommended for promotion. Has reached a dead end.
Even Gully Foyle realized in his desperation.
I had reached a dead end. I had been content to drift from moment to moment of existence for 30 years like some heavily armored creature, sluggish and indifferent. Gully Foyle, the stereotype common man. But now I was adrift in space for 170 days.
And the key to his awakening was in the lock. Presently it would turn and open the door to Holocaust. The spaceship Nomad drifted halfway between Mars and Jupiter. Whatever war catastrophe had wrecked it had taken a sleek steel rocket 100 yards long and 100 feet broad and mangled it into a skeleton on which was mounted the remains of cabins, holds, decks, and bulkheads. Great rents in the hull were blazes of light on the sun side and frosty blotches of stars on the dark side. The SS Nomad was a weightless emptiness of blinding sun and jet shadow, frozen and silent. The wreck was filled with a floating conglomerate of frozen debris that hung within the destroyed vessel like an instantaneous photograph of an explosion. The minute gravitational attraction of the bits of rubble for each other was slowly drawing them into clusters, which were periodically torn apart by the passage through them of the one survivor still alive on the wreck, Gulliver Foyle, AS-128/127-006.
I lived in the only airtight room left intact in the wreck, a tool locker off the main deck corridor. The locker was 4 feet wide, 4 feet deep, and 9 feet high. It was the size of a giant's coffin. 600 years before, it had been judged the most exquisite oriental torture to imprison a man in a cage that size for a few weeks. Yet I had existed in this lightless coffin for 5 months, 20 days, and 4 hours.
Who are you? Gully Foyle is my name. Where are you from? Terra is my nation. Where are you now? Deep space is my dwelling place. Where are you bound? That's my destination.
On the 171st day of his fight for survival, Foyle answered these questions and awoke.
My heart hammered and my throat burned. I groped in the dark for the air tank, which shared my coffin with me, and checked it. The tank was empty. Another would have to be moved in at once. So this day would commence with an extra skirmish with death, which I accepted with mute endurance. I felt through the locker shelves and located a torn spacesuit. It was the only one aboard Nomad, and I no longer remembered where or how I had found it. I sealed the tear with emergency spray, but no way of refilling or replacing the empty oxygen cartridges on the back. I got into the suit. It would hold enough air from the locker to hold me 5 minutes in vacuum, no more. I opened the locker's door and plunged out into the black frost of space. The air in the locker puffed out with me, and its moisture congealed into a tiny snow cloud that drifted down the torn main deck corridor. I heaved the exhausted air tank, floated it out of the locker, and abandoned it. 1 minute was gone. I turned and propelled myself through the floating debris toward the hatch to the ballast hold. I did not run. My gait was a unique locomotion of free fall and weightlessness, thrust with foot, elbow, and hand against deck, wall, and corner, a slow motion darting through space like a bat flying underwater. I shot through the hatch into the dark side ballast hold. 2 minutes were gone.
Like all spaceships, Nomad was ballasted and stiffened, with the mass of her gas tanks laid down the length of her keel, like a long lumber raft tapped at the sides by a labyrinth of pipe fittings.
I took a minute disconnecting an air tank. I had no way of knowing whether it was full or already exhausted, whether I would fight it back to my locker only to discover that it was empty and my life was ended. Once a week, I endured this game of space roulette. There was a roaring in my ears. The air in my spacesuit was rapidly going foul. I yanked a massy cylinder toward the ballast hatch, ducked to let it sail over my head, then thrust myself after it. I swung the tank through the hatch. 4 minutes had elapsed, and I was shaking and blacking out. I guided the tank down the main deck corridor and pulled it into the tool locker. I slammed the locker dogged it, found a hammer on a shelf, and swung it thrice against a frozen tank to loosen the valve. I twisted the handle grimly. With the last of my strength, I unsealed the helmet of my spacesuit, lest I suffocate within the suit, while the locker filled with air. If this tank contained air.
He fainted, as he had fainted so often before, never knowing whether this was death.
Who are you? Gully Foyle. Where are you from? Terra. Where are you now? Space. Where are you bound?
He awoke. He was alive. He wasted no time on prayer or thanks, but continued the business of survival. In the darkness, he explored the locker shelves where he kept his rations. There were only a few packets left. Since he was already wearing the patched spacesuit, he might just as well run the gauntlet of vacuum again and replenish his supplies.
I flooded my spacesuit with air from the tank, resealed my helmet, and sailed out into the frost and light again. I squirmed down the main deck corridor and ascended the remains of the stairway to the control deck, which was no more than a roofed corridor in space. Most of the walls were destroyed. With the sun on my right and the stars on my left, I shot aft toward the galley storeroom. Halfway down the corridor, I passed a door frame still standing foursquare between deck and roof. The leaf still hung on its hinges, half open, a door to nowhere. Behind it was all space and the steady stars.
As Foyle passed the door, he had a quick view of himself reflected in the polished chrome of the leaf. Gully Foyle, a giant creature, bearded, crusted with dried blood and filth, emaciated, with sick, patient eyes, and followed always by a stream of floating debris, the raffle disturbed by his motion, and following him through space like the tail of a festering comet.
I turned into the galley storeroom and began looting with the methodical speed of 5 months' habit. Most of the bottled goods were frozen solid and exploded. Much of the canned goods had lost their containers, for tin crumbles to dust in the absolute zero of space. I gathered up ration packets, concentrates, and a chunk of ice from the burst water tank. I threw everything into a large copper cauldron, turned and darted out the storeroom, carrying the cauldron.
At the door to nowhere, Foyle glanced at himself again, reflected in the chrome leaf framed in the stars. Then he stopped his motion in bewilderment. He stared at the stars behind the door, which had become familiar friends after 5 months. There was an intruder among them, a comet, it seemed, with an invisible head and a short, spurting tail. Then Foyle realized he was staring at a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course that must pass him.
No. No, man. No.
He was continually suffering from hallucinations. He turned to resume the journey back to his coffin. Then he looked again. It was still a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course which must pass him. He discussed the illusion with eternity.
6 months already. Is it now? You listen to me, lousy gods. I talking a deal is all. I look again, sweet prayer men. If it's a ship, I'm yours. You own me. But if it's a gaff, man, if it's no ship, I unseal right now and blow my guts. We both ballast level us. Now reach me the sign. Yes or no is all.
Foyle looked for a third time. For the third time, he saw a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course which must pass him. It was the sign. He believed. He was saved.
I shoved off and went hurtling down the control deck corridor toward the bridge. But at the companionway stairs, I restrained myself. I could not remain conscious for more than a few more moments without refilling my spacesuit. I gave the approaching spaceship one pleading look, then shot down to the tool locker and pumped my suit full.
He mounted to the control bridge. Through the starboard observation port, he saw the spaceship, stern rockets still flaring, evidently making a major alteration in course, for it was bearing down on him very slowly. On a panel marked flares, Foyle pressed the distress button. There was a 3-second pause, during which he suffered. Then, white radiance blinded him as the distress signal went off in 3 triple bursts. 9 prayers for help. Foyle pressed the button twice again, and twice more the flares flashed in space, while the radioactives incorporated in their combustion set up a static howl that must register on any waveband of any receiver.
The stranger's jets cut off. I had been seen. I would be saved. I was reborn.
Foyle darted back to his locker and replenished his spacesuit again. He began to weep. He started to gather his possessions. A faceless clock, which he kept wound just to listen to the ticking. A lug wrench with a hand-shaped handle, which he would hold in lonely moments. An egg slicer upon whose wires he would pluck primitive tunes. He dropped them in his excitement, hunted for them in the dark, then began to laugh at himself. He filled his spacesuit with air once more and capered back to the bridge. He punched a flare button labeled Rescue. From the hull of the Nomad shot a sunlet that burst and hung, flooding miles of space with harsh white light.
Come on, baby, you. Hurry up, man. Come on, baby. Baby, you.
Like a ghost torpedo, the stranger slid into the outermost rim of light, approaching slowly, looking him over. For a moment, Foyle's heart constricted. The ship was behaving so cautiously that he feared she was an enemy vessel from the outer satellites. Then he saw the famous red and blue emblem on her side, the trademark of the mighty industrial clan of Prestane, Prestane of Terra, powerful, munificent, beneficent. And he knew this was a sister ship, for the Nomad was also Prestane owned. He knew this was an angel from space hovering over him.
Sweet sister, baby angel, fly away home with me.
End of episode 1.